President Boren, what is a letter to America?
Well, it really is literally an attempt to write to the people of the United States about the problems we face, the challenges we face, what our future needs to look like, what we should be doing. And I decided to write it in a very simple letter form after I had an experience. I was interviewing some of the brightest young people in America who were competing for the Rhodes Scholarship. And I asked them the question, how long do you think America will be one of the world's leading superpower, or if not the leading superpower? And they had answered every tough question up to that time very, very quickly. There were about a dozen of them. I asked each one the same question in turn, individually. And they couldn't answer the question. They looked down at their feet, they paused. I said, well, you know, we're just 6% of the world's population. China and India are going to have economies at the rate they're growing that'll be in gross terms as large as ours. They have 10 times as many people. What makes you think we're always going to be the world's leading superpower? And they literally had not thought about it. And I thought, well, you know, with all the challenges, we're not in the top 20 anymore in our educational scores, K through 12. Our middle class is shrinking. Our share of the world's wealth is going down 1% a year, a very quick drop. Why aren't they thinking about it? So I tried to help them, and I said, well, what are the things you think will determine how long we're the world's leading power and most influential country in the world? And finally, after a minute or two, one of them said, education? I said, well, that's a good place to start because that's one of our great assets. If we're going to be the leader of the world and we're only 6% of the population, we have to have all of our intellectual talent in this country fully developed. And we do right now have 90% of the greatest universities in the world, according to world surveys, even though we're only 6% of the population. So that has to be part of the answer. But what really worried me, you could tell that they wanted just to say, forever, of course it's going to be forever. They just hadn't thought about it. They hadn't thought about even the possibility that we wouldn't be. And you know, the interesting thing is, ask that same question about 6 or 7 years later to a group of honors students that I was teaching. And it was a totally different answer. Instead, some of them said 10 years, 20 years, short periods of time. So they'd gone from just assuming we would always lead the world to really having a pessimistic outlook, just like 2/3 of the American people who think our future won't be as great as our past. So I was very disturbed by the reactions in both cases, but for very different reasons.
What disturbed you?
Well, I think first of all, just in the beginning, that we weren't talking about the important things enough. You know, we talk about scandal, or we talk about entertainment, or we talk about sports. Not that I'm against sports. All those things are interesting things, but we needed to be talking about what's going to determine the future of these young people. How can we make our system start working better and come to better conclusions? How can we make sure that more of young people are going to college? We've dropped from first in the world to 12th in the world in just 8 years in the percentage of college-age population going on to population. From first to 12th in 8 years. So we've got to get engaged. And out of frustration, I wrote this letter to my fellow Americans saying, you know, we have a lot to think about. We can do it. We need that can-do American spirit. We don't need pessimism, but we better get about doing what needs to be done.
What impact do you think the book has had?
Well, it's been interesting. I'm sure it's had influence with some. You know, you never think it's had a huge amount of influence, but various people who got interested in the book, some of them took it on themselves to send every member of Congress, and in fact, every member of all the state legislatures a copy of the book. And it was amazing the number of letters I got back from that. Some, for example, at some of the other state universities, people got interested and began having the freshmen read it, and that made me feel really good. So there have been places in which I think it has been read, but you know, you just think about some of the shocking things we need to work on. That only 7% of the students in the United States, college students, have to take a single course in American history or American government to graduate from college. And they don't know their history. And my goodness, the high schoolers, half of them didn't know which side we were on in World War II in a recent study. Half of them thought we were on the side of Nazi Germany. I mean, how are you going to build the kind of future you need for your country without knowing what happened in the past? And not to mention the cost of campaigns, what's happening to grassroots democracy in our country when the cost has gone up 30 times just since the Carter-Ford race. And now we have super PACs where people can write $5 million checks, and we've seen it in the primaries, change the course of how a primary is going when the money comes flooding in. So things like that, and the fact that Democrats and Republicans have forgotten how to work together. You know, there are a lot of things we have to work on. We can do it, our history shows it, but we have to unite and get together and do it.
Where did the idea come to write this book? Where were you? What came to your mind?
Well, I guess from having that first experience in the Rhodes Scholarship interviews, I started thinking about it. I thought, well, you know, if the best and brightest in this country are not really thinking long and hard about the 10 or so things we need to do if we're going to assure America's future, think about the rest of the population. We're oblivious to the kinds of challenges. You know, if you have a Pearl Harbor or you have something dramatic that happens to your country, we get together as Americans and we unite and we make things happen. But when you're dealing with an erosion of our strength, not as just a dramatic single day event like Pearl Harbor, sometimes we don't pay enough attention to it. And you know, whether something destroys you like a thunderclap of some dramatic event, or whether over a 10 or 15 year period, the leadership of the country is really taken away from us in terms of the rest of the world, the result's the same, and a diminished experience, diminished opportunities for the next generation. So I just thought I wanted to sort of shake the American people and say, pay attention, pay attention. You know, our middle class is shrinking 1% a year, our two parties aren't working together, they can't agree on anything. What would have happened at the end of World War II if the Democrats and Republicans hadn't gotten together and had the Marshall Plan? How hard was that? Can you imagine what the Republicans could have done to criticize the Democrats for raising taxes on the American people to give it to countries like Germany and Italy that had fought against us and killed Americans during World War II? Oh, think of the 30-second attack spot you could have had. But instead, there were some Republicans like Senator Vandenberg who said, look, we've got to work together. I've got to work with Secretary Marshall. We've got to work together across party lines because otherwise the communists are going to sweep in and take over all of Western Europe. So where has that spirit gone? Our government's become dysfunctional in terms of all the two parties are doing is fighting each other in some way. And I suggested in the book, someday we're going to have to administer some shock therapy to get the two-party system working again. And maybe the way to do that is get a Democrat and Republican to run together on a ticket and say we're going to set up a unified cabinet, half Democrats and half Republicans, like Churchill had all parties represented in his cabinet during the war in Britain. We're going to have to do something really dramatic to shake this system back to its senses again and work together to take care of our budget deficits. Everybody's going to have to join in. Everybody's going to have to sacrifice to think a little more about history before we plunge into some place like Afghanistan where Alexander the Great couldn't tame those tribes, and neither could the British, and neither could the Russians. We need to sit back and really seriously pool our best thinking in this country and work together again.
Since you've written the book, what has changed?
Well, unfortunately, I've written a little postscript that came out last year in a new little edition of the book. Things have not gotten better. They've gotten worse, and in a number of ways. The cost of campaigns, that's gotten worse. The inability of the two parties to work together has gotten worse. The shrinkage of our standing in the world, I mean, in terms of our share of the world's economic output, has escalated, it's accelerated. Our rankings in education, K through 12, have fallen even more. And as I said, the percentage of our students going on to college, we've dropped from 1st to 12th in just 8 years. So in this period of time since I've written the book, I think our challenges have even gotten more severe. And above all, I really worry about the pessimism in this country. I think some of it comes from some of the things I've mentioned. People, when you ask them, do you think Congress represents people like you or cares about people like you? You know, only about 8 to 10% say yes. 90% say no. Why do they say no? Well, they know that the average member of Congress gets far more than half of their campaign contributions from people outside the state who've never even been in their districts. they don't feel like we people at the grassroots have the ability to do much because this is a wash in money and the candidate 95% of the time, the one with the most money wins. They really become cynical, and that's frightening. Cynicism is a very frightening thing. It begins to break the bond between representatives who are supposed to represent us in government and ourselves. So and then when they say 2/3, sometimes even 3/4 say, I'm pessimistic about our future. I don't think my children and grandchildren will have as good a chance as I've had. I almost want to shout back at them, that's not American. One thing we've always believed as Americans, that we could do it. We could provide even more opportunities for the next generation. And every generation in a row of Americans has had greater opportunities. So I want to say, no, stop that. Instead, let's get together. We can solve this problem. We're a free country, so I really, in the long run, I'm an optimist. I don't think that China, for example, is going to overtake us in the long run. Why? We're a free country. They're a controlled society. I think freedom itself creates an environment of opportunity and creativity. And look at the number of Nobel Prize winners we still have compared to the whole rest of the world put together. We dominate. So I'm a believer in our future. And the other thing is, these students that I teach here at the university, that I'm with every day, they make me optimistic about the future. They're old-fashioned in a lot of ways. We have hundreds of thousands, literally, of volunteer hours performed by our students who are already getting life experience, out helping the rest of the community, working with nonprofits. For example, our journalism college has a program in advertising. They have an advertising agency where students are out doing pro bono work for nonprofit organizations, and they're learning how to really do a job and work at the same time in pro bono organizations. I could go on with the kinds of opportunities, and we also have them seeing the rest of the world. In the U.S., only 2% of college students study abroad in the course of their career. That's where we were 15 years ago. Now we're above 25%, and we're projected to be at 50% in 5 more years. So we're doing things to try to prepare our students to live in this global society, and they're all going to be living in it.
You mentioned pessimism, if we could go back, as that's what you've noticed, an increase in pessimism. How do you think, your opinion, your plan to that could change that? How we could?
Well, I think that perhaps there are a couple of things that probably give us the most pessimism, or 2 or 3 maybe. One is, we're wise enough to know you can't live beyond your means forever. Even if our politicians don't have the courage to say, look, we're going to have to increase our revenue and we're going to have to reduce our spending. We're going to have to do both. And we're going to have to touch every single American in the process. Shared sacrifice. Instead, one party says, don't touch our constituency, the ones that get entitlements, and the other constituents say, don't tax the top 1%, even if they have 30% of the income in the country anymore. We'll have to do all of that. Well, there can't be any sacred cows. Democratic sacred cows and Republican sacred cows are all going to have to share in the sacrifice. There's something more important than these 2 parties. It's called the United States of America, and we have to get together and do that. I think the system awash in money, I think that makes people feel representative democracy is not working because it's bought and paid for. They don't listen to most of it unless you can write a $5 million check to a super PAC. Who's going to listen to you? I really think that's a big part of it. I'd like to see the next president really set up a bipartisan cabinet. I'd like to see how that would work. I would really, and get people of the other party very much involved in the process. I'd like to see them be very hands-on in terms of working with both sides of the aisle in Congress and coming up with plans so the president would come out and say, here's the president's proposal. No, the president's already been working for 6 weeks intensively with a group of, say, congressmen and senators from both parties, and come out and say, this is our bipartisan proposal. I mean, I think there's some things that even in this very difficult time we can do to make the system work better. And I think if people saw that light at the end of the tunnel, I think they'd begin to change their attitudes.
Do you think the current administration can do what you just suggested?
Well, I hope so. I've talked to both administrations while I'm now in education, And out of day-to-day politics, I still do co-chair. It's a bipartisan group. It's called the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. It goes all the way back to President Eisenhower established it. And Senator Chuck Hagel, a former Republican senator from Nebraska, and I, a former Democratic senator, co-chair it. We try to give very good bipartisan advice on sensitive national security issues to the president. The group works together very, very well. And I think you could do the same thing with key members of the current congressional committees. And it's something that really ought to be tried. And whoever gets elected president this next time, I hope they'll try something like that.
You mentioned the advisory board. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What's your role on there?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about that. The presidents, ever since it was established, have assigned, it's mainly composed of more senior people who've been, for example, I chaired the Senate Intelligence Committee when I was in the Senate for 6 years, dealt with the most sensitive secret programs of the government, helped to oversee agencies like the CIA and the rest of it. Many of us have experience that are on this committee, having some are straight out of the intelligence community. Maybe they used to work for the CIA. Others are out of public office that dealt with national security issues. So the president, when he has something really sensitive going on, he wants input, advice, or even advice about broad issues. Obviously, the world's going to change as we wind down the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the role of the intelligence communities is going to change. It's kind of like when the Cold War ended and you had half the intelligence community, maybe 90% of it, focused on the Soviet Union as a target back then. Well, obviously, the world became much more complex and you needed to know a lot of different things, and it wasn't just one country you were watching. So it had to change. And so we try to give advice on big, broad questions like that, and sometimes on very small, specific secret programs. Are they doing what they should? So I think it gives the president a good sounding board for outside advice.
Given the political climate today, are you pessimistic or optimistic about our future in reference to historical context? I mean, you mentioned earlier, and I heard you say it today, about if you don't know where you've been, you're not going to know where you're going. So if you could sum that up.
Well, I'm still, with all the worries I have, with all the worries I have about the two parties not working together and not seeming to have understood how they did work together historically and must again. They must relearn that lesson of history. Well, I really worry about budget deficits, and again, that's going to take, it's just like the Marshall Plan. It's going to take the cooperation of the two parties to make that happen. They're going to have to quit worrying about the blame game and get in and say, let's all take the blame, let's do what we need to do. In spite of all of that, I'm still an optimist. And as I said, part of it is my faith in a free society. I think a free society is going to defeat, in the long run, economic competition or whatever. They're going to win out over a controlled society. But above all else, it's my contact. I feel like the luckiest person in the world to get to be with this generation of students who are going to be our future leaders. They're just an inspiration to me. I can't tell you how deeply I believe in them. And I can hardly wait until they're in charge of this country. We're going to see a lot of improvement over my generation, or maybe the generation that's at least part of a generation right behind me. I believe when they get in charge, we're going to really make great strides. I just believe in them, and I'm so glad I have the ability to be president of a university at this moment, and I get to share friendships with them, and I get to be with them, and I get to try to answer their probing questions and all the rest of it, and to feel their energy, their talent, and above all, their desire to give back. They're just people with good values, and so that makes me believe in the future of America.
President Boren, thank you very much.
Thank you.